Story 1 begins with Sarah, a graphic designer from Portland who decided she needed a break from city life. She'd been working crazy hours for months, and when her boss finally approved some time off, she knew exactly what she wanted to do. She'd seen this adorable little cabin listed on a vacation rental website, tucked away in the Cascade Mountains about 3 hours from her apartment. The photos showed a perfect winter wonderland. Snow-covered pine trees, a stone fireplace, windows that looked out onto miles of pristine forest. The reviews were glowing. Previous guests talked about the peaceful isolation, the crackling fires, the way the snow muffled every sound until you felt like you were living inside a snow globe. Sarah booked it for a long weekend in February, right when the weather forecast was calling for a major storm system to move through the region. Most people would have seen that as a reason to cancel, but for her it was exactly what she wanted. She packed her laptop, plenty of coffee, and enough groceries for 4 days of complete solitude. The drive up was exactly what she'd hoped for. The snow started falling just as she left Portland, light flakes that danced in her headlights and made the whole world look like a fairy tale. Her car handled the mountain roads just fine, and when she finally pulled into the cabin's driveway, she felt that perfect sense of satisfaction that comes from executing a plan flawlessly. The cabin was even better than the photos had promised. Everything was clean and cozy, with the particular smell that mountain places have in winter. Wood smoke and pine needles, and something indefinable that just made you want to curl up with a book and forget the outside world existed. She unpacked her things and started a fire in the stone fireplace, watching through the windows as the snow continued to fall. By evening, it was coming down hard enough that she could barely see the trees at the edge of the property. Perfect, she thought. No distractions, no interruptions, just her and the storm and all the peace she'd been craving. The first night was everything she'd imagined. She made herself a simple dinner, opened a bottle of wine, and sat by the fire reading until her eyes got heavy. The wind outside had picked up, creating that haunting sound that only happens during real blizzards, but inside she felt completely safe and warm. She woke up the next morning to find that the storm had intensified overnight. The snow was now falling so heavily that she couldn't see more than a few feet from the windows, and the wind was strong enough to shake the cabin slightly. When she checked her phone, she discovered what she'd expected. No signal. The storm had knocked out the cell towers, leaving her completely cut off from the outside world. Most people would have felt at least a little nervous about being so isolated during such a severe storm, but Sarah felt nothing but contentment. This was exactly what she'd wanted. Complete disconnection from all the stress and noise of her regular life. She spent the morning working on some personal art projects, something she never had time for back home. The sound of the wind outside provided the perfect white noise, and the dancing flames in the fireplace created just the right amount of flickering light to make everything feel magical. It was around noon when she first noticed something that made her pause. She was making lunch in the small kitchen when she glanced out the window and saw what looked like footprints in the snow near the edge of the forest. At first, she dismissed it as her imagination, or maybe animal tracks that the blowing snow had distorted into shapes that looked human. But when she looked again a few minutes later, the tracks seemed clearer, more defined. They appeared to lead from the tree line toward the cabin, though the heavy snowfall made it impossible to see where they ended. Sarah told herself it was probably nothing. Maybe the property caretaker had come by to check on things before the storm hit. Or perhaps a hiker had gotten lost and wandered through the area. The tracks could have been there for hours, slowly filling in with fresh snow, but still visible enough to catch her eye. She went back to her lunch preparation, but found herself glancing toward the window every few minutes. Each time she looked, the tracks seemed a little more distinct, as if the wind was clearing away the new snow rather than covering them up. By mid-afternoon, the storm had reached the kind of intensity that makes you grateful to be indoors. The wind was howling with enough force to rattle the windows, and the snow was falling so thickly that Sarah could no longer see the forest at all. The world beyond the glass had become a wall of white static. She built up the fire and settled into the comfortable armchair with her book, determined to enjoy the cozy atmosphere and stop worrying about footprints that probably had a perfectly innocent explanation. The cabin felt solid and secure around her, a warm bubble of safety in the middle of nature's fury. That's when she heard the first sound that didn't belong to the storm. It was subtle, almost lost in the wind, but distinct enough to make her look up from her book. A rhythmic tapping, like someone knocking gently on wood. She sat perfectly still and listened, trying to separate the sound from the chaos outside. There it was again. 3 soft taps followed by a pause, then 3 more taps. It seemed to be coming from somewhere near the front of the cabin, but the wind made it impossible to pinpoint exactly where. Sarah's first thought was that a branch had broken loose and was being blown against the cabin by the storm. That would explain the regular rhythm and the wooden sound. She went to the front windows and peered out into the swirling snow, looking for anything that might be causing the noise. The tapping continued as she watched, but she couldn't see anything that would explain it. The porch was empty except for the mounting snow, and no branches hung close enough to the cabin to be blown against it by the wind. She stood there for several minutes, listening to the pattern repeat itself. 3 taps, pause, 3 taps, pause. It was too regular to be random, too consistent to be caused by something blowing in the wind. That's when she noticed that the footprints she'd seen earlier were no longer visible. The area where she'd spotted them was now just an unbroken expanse of white, as if the storm had finally covered them completely. But as she watched, new shapes began to appear in the snow near the cabin's foundation. Not footprints this time, but depressions that looked almost like someone had been standing there, shifting their weight from foot to foot while the snow accumulated around them. The tapping stopped abruptly, leaving only the sound of the wind. Sarah remained at the window, her heart beating faster than it had been a few minutes earlier. The rational part of her mind was still offering explanations. Ice forming and breaking off the roof, settling sounds from the cabin's wooden frame, even her own imagination filling in patterns where none existed. But something deeper, more instinctive, was telling her that she was no longer alone on this isolated mountain property. The tapping resumed just as Sarah stepped away from the window, but this time it came from a different location. Instead of the front of the cabin, the sound now seemed to be coming from the side wall, near where the kitchen window faced the forest. 3 deliberate knocks, a pause, then 3 more, as if someone was methodically working their way around the building. Sarah's mouth went dry. Branches don't move from one side of a building to another. Ice doesn't relocate itself. Whatever was making that sound was doing it intentionally, with purpose. She crept toward the kitchen window, staying low and moving as quietly as possible across the wooden floor. The storm outside seemed to have intensified even more, if that was possible. The wind was screaming now, and the snow was falling in sheets so thick it looked like a white curtain had been drawn across the world. When she reached the kitchen window, she pressed herself against the wall beside it and slowly leaned over to peer outside. At first, all she could see was the same wall of swirling snow that had obscured everything else. But as she watched, a shadow moved just at the edge of her vision. It was tall and dark, standing motionless about 10 feet from the cabin. The snow was falling so heavily that she couldn't make out any details, but the shape was unmistakably human. Someone was out there in the blizzard, just standing in her yard, facing the cabin. Sarah jerked back from the window, her heart hammering against her ribs. She pressed her back against the kitchen wall and tried to think clearly. Maybe it was someone who was lost, seeking shelter from the storm. Maybe they were hurt and needed help. The rational thing to do would be to call out, to let them know someone was inside who could assist them. But something about the way the figure had been standing there, perfectly still in the middle of a raging blizzard, made her hesitate. Normal people don't just stand motionless in conditions like that. Normal people would be moving, seeking shelter, showing some sign of distress or urgency. The tapping started again, but now it was coming from the back of the cabin. Sarah realized with growing horror that whoever was outside was indeed moving around the building, systematically checking each wall. The sound had a testing quality to it now, as if someone was looking for weak points or trying to determine the cabin's construction. She forced herself to look out the kitchen window again. The shadow was gone from where she'd seen it before, but that didn't make her feel any better. If anything, knowing that the person was moving around made everything worse. At least, when she could see them, she knew where they were. The back door was in the cabin's small mudroom, just off the kitchen. Sarah could hear the tapping coming from that direction now, closer and more distinct. 3 knocks, pause, 3 knocks. The sound was definitely coming from someone's knuckles against wood, not from any natural cause. She grabbed her phone from the counter, even though she knew there was no signal. The screen showed the same message it had all day: no service. The storm had completely cut off her connection to the outside world, leaving her alone with whatever was happening outside. The tapping moved again, this time to what sounded like the front door. Sarah realized that whoever was out there had completed a full circuit of the cabin. They had methodically tested every wall, every window, every possible entry point. Now they were back where they'd started, at the main entrance. Sarah crept toward the front of the cabin, staying away from the windows. The front door was solid wood with a good deadbolt, but suddenly that didn't feel like enough protection. The door had a small window at eye level, covered by a thin curtain that she'd barely noticed when she arrived. The tapping on the front door was different from what she'd heard before. Instead of the gentle knocks that had moved around the cabin's perimeter, this was more insistent, louder, more demanding. It came in the same pattern. 3 knocks followed by a pause, but now each knock carried an unmistakable expectation of response. Sarah stood in the living room, about 15 feet from the front door, paralyzed by indecision. Part of her still insisted that this had to be someone who needed help, someone who had gotten caught in the storm and was desperately seeking shelter. But a growing part of her was convinced that opening that door would be the worst mistake of her life. The knocking stopped abruptly. The cabin fell silent except for the wind outside. Sarah held her breath and listened, straining to hear any sound that might tell her where the person had gone. Had they given up and moved on? Had they found shelter elsewhere? Or were they still out there, waiting? She waited for what felt like an eternity but was probably only a few minutes. The storm continued to rage outside, but there were no more knocks, no more tapping, no more sounds that didn't belong to the natural chaos of the blizzard. Finally, Sarah couldn't stand the uncertainty anymore. She had to know if the person was still there. She approached the front door carefully, stepping lightly to avoid making the floorboards creak. When she reached the door, she pressed her ear against the wood and listened. Nothing but wind and snow. She reached up toward the small window, intending to move the curtain just enough to peek outside. Her hand was almost to the fabric when a face appeared on the other side of the glass. Sarah screamed and stumbled backward, nearly falling over the coffee table. The face in the window was pale and gaunt, with dark eyes that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Wet hair was plastered against the person's head, and their lips were moving as if they were speaking, but she couldn't hear any words over the sound of the storm. The face remained pressed against the glass for several long seconds, those dark eyes staring directly at Sarah. Then it disappeared, leaving only the curtain swaying slightly from the vibration of her scream. Sarah ran to the fireplace and grabbed the iron poker, holding it in front of her like a weapon. Her hands were shaking so badly she could barely maintain her grip on the handle. She backed away from the front door, keeping her eyes fixed on the small window, waiting for the face to appear again. It didn't, but a few seconds later she heard footsteps on the front porch. Not the careful, testing movements she'd been hearing before, but deliberate steps crossing the wooden planks. The person was no longer trying to be subtle or sneaky. They were making their presence known. The door handle rattled. Sarah watched in terror as the brass knob turned slowly to the right, then back to the left. Someone was testing the lock, seeing if the door would open. When it didn't, the rattling stopped, but the footsteps continued across the porch. She realized they were going to try the windows. The cabin had several windows on the ground level, and while they all had screens, none of them had bars or any other serious security features. Most of them probably just had simple latches that could be forced open without too much effort. Sarah ran to the kitchen window first, the one where she'd first seen the shadow. She could hear movement outside, the sound of someone walking through the deep snow around the cabin's foundation. She reached the window just as a hand pressed against the glass from outside. The hand was pale and wet, with long fingers that spread across the window like a spider. It pressed firmly against the glass, testing its strength, then began to push upward, trying to force the window open. Sarah grabbed a kitchen knife from the counter and held it up where whoever was outside could see it. She mouthed the word "no" and shook her head, hoping to communicate that she was armed and prepared to defend herself. The hand paused for a moment as if considering this new information. Then it resumed its upward pressure on the window. The old latch began to creak under the strain. Sarah realized that the person outside wasn't going to be deterred by threats or weapons. They had made up their mind to get inside, and they were going to keep trying until they succeeded. She ran through the cabin, checking every window and door, making sure everything was locked as securely as possible. The back door had a simple deadbolt that she turned, and she dragged a heavy wooden chair over to brace against it. The windows all had latches, but most of them looked flimsy and old. As she moved from room to room, she could hear the person outside matching her movements. Footsteps crunched through the snow, following her progress through the cabin. When she was in the bedroom, she heard testing sounds at the bedroom window. When she moved to the bathroom, the sounds followed her there. It was as if whoever was outside could see through the walls, tracking her every movement. They knew exactly where she was at all times, and they were systematically testing every possible entry point as she passed by it. Sarah ended up back in the living room, clutching the kitchen knife and the fireplace poker. The storm outside seemed to be reaching its peak intensity. The wind was howling like a living thing, and the snow was falling so hard that it looked solid, like a white wall pressing against every window. That's when she heard the sound that made her blood run cold. Someone was on the roof. Heavy footsteps were moving across the cabin's roof, directly above her head. The person had apparently given up on trying to force their way through doors and windows and had decided to look for another way in. Sarah looked up at the ceiling, following the sound of the footsteps as they moved from one end of the cabin to the other. The person seemed to be searching for something, pausing at certain spots and then moving on. Then she realized what they were looking for: the chimney. The footsteps stopped directly above the fireplace, and Sarah heard a new sound. Scratching, scraping noises that seemed to be coming from inside the chimney itself. The person was trying to climb down through the fireplace. Sarah ran to the fireplace and looked up into the chimney. The fire had died down to glowing coals, but there was still enough heat and smoke to make climbing down extremely difficult and dangerous. She could hear the scraping sounds getting closer, echoing down the brick chimney toward the firebox. Without thinking, Sarah grabbed several logs from the pile beside the fireplace and threw them onto the coals. She blew on the embers until flames began to lick at the dry wood, then added more logs until she had a roaring fire going. The scraping sounds stopped abruptly, followed by what sounded like a yelp of pain or surprise. The footsteps on the roof moved away from the chimney area, and Sarah heard them heading toward the edge of the building. She had bought herself some time, but she knew it wouldn't last long. Whoever was outside was determined and resourceful. They would find another way in eventually, and when they did, she would be trapped inside with no way to escape and no way to call for help. The wind outside seemed to be getting even stronger, if that was possible. It was making the cabin shake slightly, and she could hear tree branches snapping in the distance. The storm was turning into something truly dangerous, the kind of blizzard that could trap people for days and claim lives. But right now, the storm was the least of Sarah's problems. The real danger was the person who was circling her cabin like a predator, looking for any weakness that would let them inside. And she was starting to realize that they had no intention of giving up until they found one. The footsteps on the roof resumed, but this time they were moving with more urgency. Sarah could hear whoever was up there testing different areas, walking to various points and then stopping, as if they were looking for structural weaknesses or alternative entry points she hadn't considered. She kept the fire blazing high, knowing that the chimney was now too hot and smoke-filled for anyone to attempt climbing down. But that small victory felt hollow when she realized how many other options remained available to someone truly determined to get inside. The cabin had been built decades ago, back when security wasn't the primary concern it is today. The windows were old, the locks were simple, and there were probably a dozen ways for someone with enough motivation to force their way in. Sarah found herself mentally cataloging every potential vulnerability, imagining how she would break into this place if she were on the outside. It was a terrifying exercise that made her realize just how defenseless she really was. The person on the roof seemed to have reached the same conclusion. The footsteps moved to the back corner of the cabin, where Sarah remembered seeing a small window that opened into a storage closet. It was higher off the ground than the other windows, which was probably why she hadn't secured it as carefully as the others. She ran to the back of the cabin and found the closet. Sure enough, she could hear someone working at the window from outside. The sound of metal tools scraping against the window frame told her that this wasn't just someone using their hands anymore. They had come prepared with equipment. Sarah pressed her ear to the closet door and listened to the methodical sounds of someone carefully dismantling the window latch. This person knew what they were doing. They weren't just some desperate traveler seeking shelter from the storm. They were skilled at breaking and entering, and they had chosen her isolated cabin for reasons she didn't want to think about. The scraping stopped, replaced by the sound of the window sliding open. Cold air and snow began to pour into the closet, and Sarah heard the unmistakable sound of someone climbing through the opening. They were inside. Sarah backed away from the closet door, both weapons still clutched in her hands. She could hear movement in the small space, the sound of someone carefully lowering themselves to the floor, and then pausing to listen. She held her breath, trying to stay as quiet as possible. Maybe, if she didn't make any sound, they would think the cabin was empty. Maybe they would take whatever they wanted and leave without bothering to search for her. But even as she thought it, she knew it wasn't true. This person had seen her face in the window. They knew someone was here, and they had gone to too much trouble breaking in to leave without completing whatever they had come here to do. The closet door opened slowly, with just the slightest creak of hinges that hadn't been oiled in years. Sarah watched from across the room as a dark figure emerged from the storage space. In the dim light from the fireplace, she could make out the silhouette of someone tall and thin, wearing dark winter clothing that dripped with melting snow. The person stood perfectly still for several seconds, letting their eyes adjust to the cabin's interior. Then their head turned slowly from side to side, scanning the room with predatory patience. When their gaze fell on Sarah, they stopped moving entirely. For a long moment, neither of them moved or spoke. The only sounds were the crackling of the fire and the endless howling of the storm outside. Then the intruder smiled. It wasn't a friendly smile or even a threatening one. It was something else entirely, something that made Sarah's skin crawl and her grip tighten on the weapons in her hands. It was the smile of someone who had been looking forward to this moment, who had planned for it and anticipated it with genuine pleasure. "Hello, Sarah," the person said in a voice that was calm and conversational, as if they were greeting an old friend. "I've been waiting out there for quite a while. Thank you for finally letting me in." The fact that they knew her name hit Sarah like a physical blow. This wasn't random. This wasn't someone who had just happened upon her cabin during the storm. This was someone who had come here specifically for her, someone who had planned this encounter in advance. "Who are you?" she managed to ask, though her voice came out as barely more than a whisper. The intruder took a step closer, moving with the unhurried confidence of someone who knew they were in complete control of the situation. "Does it matter? You won't remember anyway." That phrase sent a chill down Sarah's spine that had nothing to do with the cold air still pouring through the open closet window. There was something about the way they said it, with casual certainty, that suggested they had done this before. "What do you want?" she asked, raising the kitchen knife to chest level. The intruder glanced at the weapons in her hands and chuckled softly. "Oh, Sarah, those aren't going to help you. Nothing you can do is going to help you now." They reached into their coat and pulled out something that gleamed in the firelight. At first, Sarah thought it was another knife, but as her eyes focused on it, she realized it was a syringe filled with some kind of clear liquid. "This will make everything so much easier," the intruder said, holding up the syringe so she could see it clearly. "For both of us. You won't feel anything, and you won't remember anything. It's really quite humane." Sarah's mind raced, trying to process what was happening and figure out how to respond. The person standing in her cabin wasn't just a burglar or even a typical home invader. They were something much worse, something that required planning and preparation and specialized equipment. She thought about all the true crime podcasts she'd listened to, all the documentaries about serial killers and predators who targeted isolated victims. She had always wondered how people ended up in those situations, how they failed to see the danger signs or escape when they had the chance. Now she knew. It happened exactly like this, in circumstances where escape was impossible and help was too far away to matter. The storm outside had become her prison, cutting off all communication and making travel impossible. The person standing in her living room had known this would happen. They had planned for it, waited for it, and used it to their advantage. "The storm was perfect, wasn't it?" the intruder said, as if reading her thoughts. "I've been watching the weather reports for weeks, waiting for the right conditions. A cabin this isolated, a storm this severe, and someone like you who thinks a weekend alone in the mountains sounds like a good idea." They took another step closer, and Sarah backed toward the fireplace. The heat from the flames warmed her back, but it also meant she was running out of room to retreat. "You're not the first, you know," the intruder continued conversationally. "There have been others. Other cabins, other storms, other people who thought they wanted to get away from it all. It's amazing how many opportunities these vacation rental websites provide for someone who knows how to look." Sarah's blood went cold as she realized the implications. This person was using rental properties to find victims, targeting people who would be alone and isolated during severe weather events. They had turned her desire for peace and solitude into a trap. "How many?" she asked, though part of her didn't want to know the answer. The intruder shrugged. "Does it matter?" The important thing is that I've gotten very good at this. Very efficient. The whole process usually takes less than an hour, and then it's like nothing ever happened. They held up the syringe again, turning it so the liquid inside caught the firelight. This is a paralytic agent mixed with a memory inhibitor. You'll be conscious but unable to move, and afterward you won't remember any of it. It's really quite sophisticated. Sarah felt her legs growing weak as the full horror of her situation became clear. This wasn't someone who wanted to rob her or even kill her quickly. This was someone who had perfected a system for doing something much worse, something that required their victims to be alive but helpless. The beauty of it is that you'll wake up tomorrow morning thinking you just had a nice, peaceful weekend in the mountains, the intruder explained. You'll pack up your things and drive home. Maybe tell your friends what a wonderful time you had. You'll never know that anything happened. They smiled again, that same disturbing expression that seemed to find genuine pleasure in her terror. And I'll be long gone, already planning the next trip. There are so many isolated cabins out there, so many people who think they want to be alone in the wilderness. Sarah realized that her only chance was to act before the intruder got close enough to use the syringe. The kitchen knife and fireplace poker suddenly felt inadequate against someone who had clearly done this many times before, but they were the only weapons she had. She gripped both handles tighter and tried to think of a strategy that might work. The intruder was between her and the front door, and the back door was probably blocked by snow anyway. The windows were too high and too small to escape through quickly, especially with someone actively trying to stop her. The fireplace behind her gave her an idea. If she could somehow get the intruder close enough to the flames, she might be able to use the fire as a weapon. It wasn't much of a plan, but it was better than just standing there waiting to become another victim. "You know what the funny thing is?" the intruder said, taking another step closer. "Most people fight at first, but they always give up eventually. They realize there's nowhere to run, no one to call for help, no way out of the situation. They accept what's going to happen and try to make it as easy as possible." They gestured toward the windows, where the storm continued to rage with undiminished fury. "Look outside, Sarah. Even if you managed to get past me, even if you made it out that door, where would you go? You'd freeze to death in that blizzard long before you found help." Sarah knew they were right about the storm, but she also knew that whatever they had planned for her was worse than dying in the cold. At least in the blizzard, she would have a chance, however small. Here in the cabin, she had none. The intruder seemed to sense her thoughts. "Don't make this harder than it has to be. I promise you won't remember any of it. In a way, it'll be like it never happened at all." "Except it will have happened," Sarah said, finding her voice again. "And you'll remember it." The intruder's smile widened. "Oh, yes, I'll remember. That's rather the point." They raised the syringe and took a final step toward her. Sarah realized that her moment had come. Whatever she was going to do, it had to be now. She feinted to the left with the kitchen knife, then spun to the right and swung the fireplace poker as hard as she could. The heavy iron connected with the intruder's wrist, sending the syringe flying across the room to shatter against the far wall. The intruder cried out in pain and anger, clutching their injured wrist. For the first time since entering the cabin, they looked surprised and off balance. Sarah didn't waste the opportunity. She pushed past them and ran for the front door, fumbling with the deadbolt while the intruder recovered behind her. She could hear them moving, probably going for another weapon or trying to block her escape. The bolt finally turned, and she yanked the door open. The storm hit her like a physical wall, driving snow and ice into her face with enough force to blind her temporarily. The cold was so intense it took her breath away, but she forced herself to step out onto the porch. Behind her, she heard the intruder curse and start moving toward the door. She had maybe seconds before they caught up with her. Sarah plunged into the blizzard, immediately sinking knee-deep into the accumulated snow. The wind was so strong it nearly knocked her over, and the flying snow made it impossible to see more than a few inches in any direction. Within moments, she was completely disoriented, unable to tell which direction led away from the cabin. But she kept moving, forcing her way through the deep snow, driven by the knowledge that whatever was behind her was worse than the storm ahead. She could hear the intruder calling her name, their voice already growing faint in the howling wind. The cold was brutal, cutting through her indoor clothes like they weren't even there. She knew she wouldn't last long in these conditions, but she also knew she had to get as far from the cabin as possible before the intruder could track her down. Her feet were already going numb, and ice was forming on her eyelashes and hair. The snow was so deep in places that she had to use her hands to pull herself forward, and the wind kept changing direction, making it impossible to maintain a straight course. After what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, Sarah's foot hit something solid. She reached down and felt the smooth metal surface of her car, buried under several feet of snow, but still recognizable. She had somehow managed to find the driveway in the whiteout conditions. The car was completely covered and probably wouldn't start even if she could dig it out, but it gave her a reference point. She knew the main road was somewhere beyond the car, though she had no idea how far or in which exact direction. She pressed on, using the car as a starting point and trying to follow what she hoped was the driveway. The cold was becoming unbearable now, and she was beginning to lose feeling in her extremities. She knew the signs of hypothermia from safety training, and she was definitely showing early symptoms. But she also knew that going back to the cabin meant certain capture by someone who had done terrible things to other people and planned to do the same to her. The storm might kill her, but at least it would be quick and clean compared to whatever awaited her back there. She stumbled forward through the snow, one step at a time, fighting against the wind and the cold and her own body's desire to simply lie down and rest. Somewhere behind her, the cabin grew smaller and darker, taking its secrets with it into the swirling white chaos of the blizzard. The second story takes us to a different kind of winter nightmare, one that began on what should have been a routine drive home from work. Marcus had been putting in long hours at the regional office, staying late to finish quarterly reports that couldn't wait until Monday. By the time he finally packed up his desk and headed for the parking garage, the snow that had been threatening all day was starting to fall in earnest. The weather reports had been calling for a significant storm, but Marcus lived less than 30 miles from his office, mostly on well-maintained highways that the state crews kept plowed during winter weather. He'd made the drive dozens of times in similar conditions, and his SUV was equipped with all-wheel drive and good winter tires. What he hadn't counted on was just how quickly the storm would intensify once he got on the road. The first few miles went smoothly enough. Traffic was light, and the snowflakes were still small and manageable, melting as soon as they hit the warm windshield. Marcus had his favorite playlist going and was actually enjoying the peaceful drive through the early evening darkness. But somewhere around mile 15, everything changed. The snow suddenly got heavier, much heavier, transforming from scattered flakes into thick sheets that his wipers could barely handle. The wind picked up too, creating that disorienting effect where the snow seemed to be flying horizontally across his headlight beams. Marcus slowed down and gripped the steering wheel tighter. He'd driven in plenty of snowstorms before, but this one was escalating faster than anything he'd experienced. The road ahead was becoming harder to distinguish from the shoulders, and the yellow center lines were disappearing under the accumulating snow. He was debating whether to pull over and wait it out when his phone buzzed with an emergency alert. "Blizzard warning," it read. "Travel not recommended. Whiteout conditions possible." Marcus glanced at his GPS and saw he still had about 12 miles to go. 12 miles that suddenly felt like crossing an ocean. The decision was made for him a few minutes later when he crested a small hill and saw brake lights glowing red through the snow ahead. Traffic had come to a complete stop. As he rolled to a halt behind a line of vehicles, he could see the problem. A semi-truck had jackknifed across both lanes, completely blocking the highway. Marcus sat there with his engine running, watching his fuel gauge and trying to stay calm. The radio was full of reports about road closures and accidents throughout the region. It sounded like the entire transportation network was shutting down under the weight of the unexpected storm. Other drivers were getting out of their cars to assess the situation, dark figures moving through the swirling snow like ghosts. Marcus rolled down his window and called to a man walking past his car. "Any word on how long we'll be stuck here?" The man stopped and leaned toward his window. "Tow trucks can't even get through this mess. Could be hours before they clear that semi." Hours. Marcus looked at his fuel gauge again. He had maybe a quarter tank left, enough to keep the heat running for a while, but not all night. And the storm showed no signs of letting up. As time passed, the situation grew worse. The snow continued to fall at an incredible rate, and the wind was strong enough to rock his SUV. Several cars around him had already run out of gas and gone dark. Their drivers had either abandoned them or were huddled inside with blankets, hoping someone would rescue them before morning. It was around 9 o'clock when Marcus noticed the headlights approaching from behind. A large pickup truck was slowly making its way up the shoulder, weaving between the stranded vehicles. The driver seemed to be checking on people, stopping at various cars and talking to their occupants. When the truck reached Marcus, the driver rolled down his window and gestured for Marcus to do the same. The man behind the wheel was middle-aged, with a friendly face and a thick winter coat. "Hey there," the man called out over the wind. "You doing okay? Got enough fuel to last the night?" Marcus shook his head. "Running low. This is turning into a real mess." "Sure is. Listen, I live just a couple miles from here, up a side road that's still passable if you know where you're going. I've got a wood stove, plenty of food, and room for a few folks to wait this out safely. Better than sitting here all night burning what gas you've got left." It sounded like a reasonable offer. Marcus could see other stranded drivers gathering around the pickup truck, apparently accepting the same invitation. The alternative was spending the night in a rapidly cooling car, hoping the storm would break by morning. "That's very kind of you," Marcus replied. "I'd appreciate the help." "Great, just follow me. We'll take it real slow, but I know these back roads like the back of my hand. Been living here for 20 years. The man introduced himself as Dale and gave Marcus his cell phone number in case they got separated. Then he began leading a small convoy of stranded motorists off the main highway and onto a narrow side road that Marcus never would have noticed on his own. The road was rough and winding, climbing up into heavily wooded hills that seemed to swallow the headlight beams. Dale had been right about knowing the area, though. He navigated the treacherous conditions with confidence, maintaining just enough speed to keep moving without sliding off into the ditches. After about 15 minutes of careful driving, they turned into a long gravel driveway that led to a modest farmhouse set back among tall pine trees. Warm yellow light glowed from the windows, and smoke was rising from the chimney. It looked exactly like the kind of place you'd want to ride out a blizzard. Dale parked his truck and came back to help guide the other vehicles to spots where they wouldn't get completely buried by drifting snow. There were 5 cars in total, including Marcus's SUV, carrying about 8 people who had accepted the offer of shelter. "Come on in, folks," Dale called out as everyone gathered their belongings from their cars. "Let's get you warmed up and fed. This storm's not going anywhere for a while." The inside of the house was everything the exterior had promised. A crackling fire in a stone fireplace, comfortable furniture, the smell of something hearty cooking in the kitchen. Dale's wife, a pleasant woman named Linda, emerged from the back of the house to greet their unexpected guests. "Oh my goodness, look at you all," she said, bustling around and taking coats. "You must be frozen solid. Dale, get that coffee going. I'll start making up beds and pulling out extra blankets." The other stranded motorists seemed as relieved as Marcus felt. There was an elderly couple from Minnesota who had been visiting relatives, a young mother with 2 small children, and a businessman who had been trying to get home to his family. Everyone was grateful to be somewhere warm and safe instead of trapped in their cars. Dale served coffee and hot soup, while Linda organized sleeping arrangements. The house was small but comfortable, and everyone seemed willing to make do with couches and air mattresses for one night. Outside, the storm continued to rage, but inside they had everything they needed. As the evening wore on, Marcus began to relax for the first time since leaving the office. The other guests were friendly, sharing stories about their travels and their lives. Dale and Linda were perfect hosts, making sure everyone had enough to eat and drink. It was around 11 o'clock when Marcus first noticed something that struck him as slightly odd. He had gotten up to use the bathroom and was walking down a short hallway when he passed a bedroom door that was slightly ajar. Through the gap, he could see what looked like several sets of car keys hanging on hooks inside the room. It seemed like a lot of keys for just 2 people, but Marcus didn't think much of it at the time. Maybe Dale and Linda collected old vehicles, or maybe they had family members who left the spare keys there. It wasn't really any of his business, but when he returned to the living room, he found himself paying closer attention to details he had overlooked before. The house was comfortable and well-furnished, but some of the items seemed oddly mismatched. Different styles of furniture, artwork that didn't quite go together, personal belongings that suggested different tastes and preferences. Marcus told himself he was being paranoid. People accumulate things over the years, and not everyone has the same decorating sense. There was no reason to read anything sinister into a few mismatched furnishings. Still, he found himself studying Dale and Linda more carefully as they moved around the house. They were certainly acting like gracious hosts, but there was something about their behavior that felt slightly rehearsed, as if they had done this exact routine many times before. The young mother with the 2 children seemed to be having similar thoughts. Marcus caught her eye a couple of times and saw a wariness there that matched his own growing unease. She kept her kids close to her and seemed reluctant to let them wander around the house. It was the businessman who first voiced what several of them were probably thinking. During a lull in the conversation, he looked around the room and said, "You folks sure are well prepared for taking in stranded travelers." "Do this often?" Dale laughed, but Marcus thought he detected a slight edge to it. "Oh, you know how it is in weather like this. People get stuck, neighbors help out. It's just the right thing to do." "Of course," the businessman replied, but his tone suggested he wasn't entirely satisfied with the answer. Linda returned from the kitchen with more coffee, and as she was refilling cups, Marcus noticed something that made his blood run cold. On her wrist was a distinctive bracelet that he recognized immediately. It was made of silver links with small turquoise stones, and it was identical to one he had given his sister for her birthday 2 years ago. His sister, who had disappeared during a winter storm while driving home from a conference in this same area. These 3 stories remind us that winter storms don't just bring snow and cold. They create perfect conditions for the kind of encounters that stay with you forever. When the roads close and the phones go dead, when help is hours or days away, that's when we discover that sometimes the most dangerous predators are the ones who look just like us. Stay safe out there, and remember that the next time a blizzard hits, you might want to think twice about who you trust when the lights go out.